On February 24, 1933, gangsters gunned down Dennis Zeigler here in Chicago. Zeigler died in his son's arms. He leaves behind 11 children and his wife, Edna.
I'm Lissa Morgans, and you're listening to Call Edna. Previously on Call Edna. On Friday, February 24th, 1933, around 6:20 in the evening, Bruce gets off at the Milwaukee Avenue surface car stop on his way home from work. According to the Chicago Tribune's reporting on the murder, Bruce makes it about a block away from his house to 3634 North Tripp. It's noted that the streetlights are out, so it's particularly dark outside. And that's when it happens. I FOIA requested the Chicago police files, but received a response that they don't exist, which I'm not sure is wholly true. I'm certain the person didn't find them, but I know the file existed at one point in time. And there's something else I want to leave you with, and that's that there may be an eyewitness to the murder. I haven't been able to verify the account. Dodie summarized the newspaper reporting, listing the name of someone who witnessed Bruce's murder. This is the first time I've seen an eyewitness account, but when I tried to pull the paper that Dodie quoted from, I couldn't find it. I went on to pull all the other papers that she had referenced, and I found almost every single one except this one. So I've been hesitant to share it because I'm just not sure, but I think it's time that we mention it, that there may be an eyewitness to this murder, and we have his name. Howard Lagerquist. Episode 6. The Web. Hello and welcome back to Call Edna. I wanted to say if you want to follow along with the investigation online, on social media, you can pretty much find Call Edna anywhere on Facebook, Instagram, Patreon, TikTok. Search Call Edna and you will find me. Today's episode is going to be a little different than usual, as I wanted to check in on some simmering questions that we've raised during the investigation, and then also go over some family history. First, checking in on those questions that are simmering in our investigation, like what is the eyewitness's actual account of Bruce's murder? And what happened to the streetlights on the night of the murder? We know they were shut off, but we don't know how. And why did the Zeigler family have police protection for that 18-month time period? And something I'm very curious about, what is the status of the police files and Westbrook Pegler's papers, the newspaper man from the 1940s who we thought might have them? And while I've been working on answering these questions, I've also found some Zeigler family stories, like newspaper op-eds from Edna and Paul, her son, about Bruce's murder, as well as Bruce's funeral card, where it lists Dr. Preston Bradley as the pastor for his funeral services, who was a notable Chicago resident and nicknamed the Protestant Pope of Chicago at that time. So let's get into it, starting with our eyewitness. I wanted to read you what Dodie had summarized in the paper she provided to the Department of Justice. She says, on February 15th, 1958, an article by William F. Mooney in the Chicago Daily News reported, quoting, "The only witness to the murder was Dr. Howard Lagerquist, who, testified that the night Zeigler was slain, the streetlights were unexplainably out of order. The rest of his story followed the usual Chicago-style gangland assassination pattern. One man stepped out from behind a tree, pumped 5 shots into Zeigler, then entered a black sedan parked at the curb, motor running, headlights off, which contained a second man. The two drove off as Dr. Lagerquist ran to Zeigler." End quote. And as I mentioned before, I did pull the Chicago Daily News from this day, and I wasn't able to find exactly what Dodie had summarized. So if anyone else is able to pull the Chicago Daily News from February 15th, 1958, Looking for a column by William F. Mooney, please reach out. There are a couple things to take away from this eyewitness account that are different than what we've learned so far in this investigation. Without being able to confirm this account in the daily news, I wanted to look at any other things to corroborate this story. First off, it says there were 5 shots into Zeigler as opposed to 3, which is what the Tribune reported after the murder. So I first looked at the state of Illinois coroner's certificate of death for Bruce's murder to see if it mentioned the number of bullet wounds that he had. But unfortunately, the injury causing death was, quote, multiple bullet wounds to the head, end quote. So it doesn't specify whether there was 3 or 5. And also it's possible maybe if this eyewitness heard 5 shots, that maybe that only 3 hit him and 2 went elsewhere. So I'm not discounting that both could be true. But something I wanted to see was, why was Dr. Lagerquist there? Did he live at the address where Bruce was shot? And it turns out that he did. According to the 1930 census, Dr. Howard Lagerquist lived at the exact address where Bruce was shot. And in fact, his father was a teacher at Schurz, the local high school, the same high school that our eyewitness would go to, and the same high school that many of the Zeigler children would go to. And a couple of those children became professional singers. So they definitely would have participated in the music program at Schurz, where the eyewitness's father was a music teacher. So I'm really inclined to say that these two families knew each other. And in fact, based on the graduation date from Schurz High School, I think it's possible that he might have gone to high school at the same time as one of the Zeigler children. And because there's 11 children, when the eyewitness had his own kids and raised them in the neighborhood, it seems like there was also an overlap there with his kids and the youngest Zeigler child, Ted, who would have been about 2 years apart in high school. With all this overlap in the neighborhood, I'm pretty convinced that these families likely knew each other. And I also think the occupation of our eyewitness is quite interesting. It appears that he was a surgeon, so I'm inclined to think if he ran out to Bruce after he was shot, he would know how many bullet wounds were in his body. So I'm not sure why we have this discrepancy between 5 versus 3. And second, we have a discrepancy in the number of people potentially involved in the act itself. Dr. Lagerquist's account only has 2 men involved, whereas the newspaper reporting said there were 3. And the question of 2 or 3 people actually led me to another question, which is there maybe a 3rd or 4th person, despite the account we have? And that's based on the streetlights being unexplainedly out of order. According to family stories, they believe that the streetlights came on maybe just 5 minutes after Bruce's murder. Quoting from Doty's paper, how did the streetlights get turned off in that one particular area and turned on again minutes after the killing? Who was the electrician behind the switch? Our eyewitness account doesn't give us much information on that. He just says they were unexplainedly out of order and doesn't say whether they were restored. But that led me down quite a rabbit hole when it comes to the streetlights. Another big thing that's sort of been left simmering is the issue with the streetlights. I mentioned in episode 1, the murder, that the streetlights were out at the time Bruce was murdered, as in they were purposefully shut off. And the first thing I wanted to do was check and see what type of streetlight they had on North Trip Avenue during that time in 1933. So I found an old publication called The Progress of Electric Street Lighting, published in January of 1923, speaking about the efforts that Chicago had made at the turn of the century post-World Fair to become one of the most illuminated cities in the world. And it has a map with cross streets as to who has gone from gas street lighting to electric street lighting. And it does in fact show that Tripp Avenue received the electrification service at some point in time between 1914 to 1923. So it was definitely an electrical grid that was in operation at Bruce's house. But if the streetlights were turned back on, it wouldn't be just a simple clipping of a transmission wire. That wouldn't really work. So that led me down a rabbit hole to look through how exactly the transmission lines in Chicago were powered. And it seems like there were about 4 large electricity plants that served the city at the time, primarily owned through the Commonwealth Edison Company. For instance, there was a huge grid on Crawford Avenue, and that's what powered the city. And I was thinking, so would someone have to be at one of those facilities in order to turn the lights on or off? I mean, that would make this murder even more complex. Or is there a local box, in the smaller grid of the neighborhood itself that you could sort of shut on or off? I think either way, we're looking at potentially a 4th person involved. I don't think it's practical if the lights were turned back on that the getaway car would have made a stop on their way out. I think someone else was involved, a 4th person who was on light duty. Or if they didn't actually come back on right away and were in fact serviced by the city, I do think it's possible that one of the people in the car, maybe the passenger who didn't have any role that we knew of, clipped the wire maybe 5 or 10 minutes before Bruce was murdered. Either way, it's been lingering in my head, and I'm sure it probably has for you too. So I wanted to go through what I've been able to find about the lights, and it's not as much as I'd hoped for. I'll also say that by the 1950s, these lights became radio controlled, but I didn't find any evidence that they became radio controlled prior to that. So it's not like someone could be in a remote location controlling it. Getting back to some unanswered questions, I wanted to bring up the police protection that we spoke about in episode 1. I know early on in the murder, we talked about the 18 months of police protection that Bruce had at his house and on West Adams Street at his union headquarters. And after talking with some members of Bruce's family, I finally got a lead as to maybe why there was police protection at these places for Bruce and his family. And it's because of a kidnapping attempt. Later on in her life, Edna told a family member that Ted Zeigler, their youngest child, was almost kidnapped out of their yard. The story goes that he was playing in the backyard with his friend. And the way a lot of Chicago houses are set up is that there's an alleyway that runs behind the houses, so it would abut right to the backyard. Apparently, a black car came down the alley, and 2 guys in trench coats got out. And Ted and his friend immediately ran. It was almost as if they were prepared for that kind of moment, and they weren't caught. But this is the incident that likely got Bruce and Edna the police protection. And this makes sense to me because I was thinking about how you would get a city to expend that level of resources on you. And kidnapping was extremely popular with organized crime at this time in Chicago. So this story adds up to me in terms of that's enough that you would have to allege to get Chicago interested, and it's not an attenuated fear. This was really something that was happening at the time, and this kind of crime was not just limited to Chicago. If you know, there's the famous Lindbergh kidnapping that happened in 1932 in New Jersey, where a 20-month-old baby was kidnapped from their house. And so going after their youngest son, who would have been about 5 at this time, would definitely raise a lot of alarms for Chicago police in terms of how they would be able to protect Bruce and his family going forward. And it made me think about essentially an op-ed that Edna had written to the Chicago Tribune that was published on February 27th, 1934, entitled Victims of a Murder. So just about a year after Bruce's murder, she writes, quoting, "Just 1 year ago today, my dear husband, Dennis Bruce Zeigler, was taken away from his loving family, myself and 11 children, by murder by Chicago racketeers. His cruel death so shocked my eldest son that he passed away last Thanksgiving Day. He died of a broken heart. These racketeers who murdered my husband were well known throughout the labor unions and are still walking the streets as free as the air, while I am still grieving the loss of my dear one greatly and trying to carry on, trying hard to keep my home, which I'm afraid I cannot do much longer. I think it is a very sad plight for our city to stand for such a cruel murder to go unnoticed. When is justice going to be shown? Miss Dennis Bruce Zeigler." End quote. And Edna was not the only family member who wrote at a time to newspapers about Bruce's death. Another one of their children, Paul, also wrote into the Tribune on May 15, 1943. Quoting, "I was quite elated over the exposure of certain racketeering factions, particularly by those concerned in the brutal slaying of my father, Dennis Bruce Zeigler, printed in your edition of March 27. It is a certainty that all hardworking laborers, working for rights as human beings, as well as having the opportunity to participate with their own individual minds in labor and in functions, cherish the martyrdom of my father personified for these just causes. The truly criminal part of the whole system is that its tentacles reach defiantly into the American Federation of Labor, and therefore necessitate handling by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So long as such steps are not taken, the corruption shall exist in full bloom. I'm fighting out here for those things, so are you on the home front. Sergeant Paul G. Zeigler." End quote. The time period in which this is written is not lost on me, and Paul is writing from an APO address. And I assume he's writing this op-ed not only because of the Tribune's article on March 27th, that was the publication where Edna first gave the 3 names from the list, but also because Westbrook Pegler, the newspaper man I've mentioned, begins writing about Bruce at this time, and Pegler discussed Bruce's murder in at least 4 or 5 columns from spring to summer of 1943. But before we dive too much into Pegler, I did want to share something we found in the family papers in Chicago, and that's that Paul, when he was 14 years old, wrote a poem in 1933 about his dad's passing. We came across it, and I shared it with my dad. Look at this picture of this Cabbage Patch doll.
It's great. Ooh. Interesting.
Thanks. Okay. Gary, I wanted to show you this. So Paul Zeigler, one of the kids, we found a poem he wrote about his dad in 1933.
Oh, wow.
A quiet man, a fearless man, a man who loved his foe.
Mm-hmm.
Loved. Through stress and strain and fight and pain, he loved his neighbor just the same. He wasn't much for going, 'cause he stayed with 69 and wasn't used to moaning over things that learned.
Baird?
I couldn't tell. Baird a sign. We know his time is over, forced by friend and foe. Like a fighting soldier, his time must come to go. But after all, it is so sad, because he was my dad.
Aw.
It's sweet.
So now that was that must have been after he was ex-murdered.
Yeah, age 14. If you were murdered, I'll write you poetry too.
What's that?
I'll write poetry for you if you're murdered.
Wow.
That's terrible.
I'll write a whole book, Verse and Reflection by me.
Will you make it nice handwriting?
I'll learn
He,
his exact style of handwriting.
because he obviously put some effort into that.
I know it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Another thing about the Zeigler family is that they were quite funny and constantly cracking jokes with one another and my dad and I are much the same. We've also had another tip come in that I wanted to relay, and that's that one of Bruce's children, Bessie, was his at-home secretary during his union days, which I didn't personally know. And those papers were kept by Bessie and her family members and are currently stored in a box in an attic and waiting for me to go through them. I'm not sure what this box exactly has, besides definite copies of union correspondence, but as we know, Bruce was an incredible record keeper and note taker, so I'm very curious if there's snippets of the journal that went missing after his murder potentially in this attic file, or what exactly Bessie had and kept on his behalf. Something else that has been unresolved in our universe are the police files in their unknown location. And that's where Pegler, who, as a reminder, is our 1940s reporter who actually wins a Pulitzer Prize for work adjacent to Bruce's murder, comes in. He seemed to have information about Bruce's murder that I presume came from the police file, and he spoke about the file in his articles. And his papers are available in archive at the Herbert Hoover Library in Iowa. But, and this is quite topical, as of the time of recording this episode, we're in a government shutdown, and that library is not accessible. So I've rescheduled my trip to visit the library, but I wanted to remind you that that is still out there, and to me, that would be a huge lead if there's any bit of the police records or even the personal notes that Pegler had on Bruce's case available in his archive. And the archive itself is quite lengthy, so I do think there's a good chance that there's something. I mean, he wrote about Bruce's murder for years. And I also want to say, if you look into Pegler's background at all, you'll notice that it's problematic. And he was actually interested in Bruce's case because he was anti-labor union. And he wanted to show that labor unions were corrupt through stories like Bruce's. And I bet if family members were keeping track of Pegler's reportings, part of them was probably happy that he was interested in Bruce's case and maybe new details were coming up. But a part of me thinks that they were also quite bitter, as Pegler used Bruce's story to further his own political lens. And that brings us to another thing I've been wanting to discuss because I'm just so honored that one of my family members has passed this down to me. I have one of the original funeral cards, and I thought it was really interesting who was listed as the person overseeing the services, and that was Dr. Preston Bradley. As I mentioned, he's nicknamed the Protestant Pope of Chicago, and he was a really important figure in Chicago at this time. To give a little background on him, he was a very civic-minded pastor who helped form the People's Church of Chicago, which was founded under the Unitarian Conference, and that grew to be the largest Unitarian congregation in the United States at that time. He was extremely popular because he also had broad radio programming, he was an author, he was also an avid traveler, and an activist, specifically against racial discrimination. But he also aligned himself with organized labor. And there are some critiques that I saw of Dr. Bradley because some people equate his church to one of the first megachurch experiences, which I guess is conflicting with Unitarian tradition because it was seen that he was very ego-driven. But I've also read many other accounts where it says, yes, he was a popular figure, but he truly was not egotistical in nature and genuinely believed in the betterment of humankind. And he took on unpopular social issues at his time. He was against fascism, he was against discrimination against Jews, he was an early critic of the Vietnam War, and also had aligned himself with organized labor. So I do think it was incredibly powerful that he gave the funeral services for Bruce. On the front of the funeral card, it says, "A memento of a friend," and has the following quote: "From the loss of our friends, Teach us to enjoy and improve those who remain. Attributed to Channing. Then, as you open the inside, on the left there's a picture of Bruce with the dates he was born and passed away in. And then on the right, you have the series of events for the funeral services. And that's what lists Reverend Preston Bradley, pastor of the People's Church of Chicago and the Maplewood Lodge, number 964, as officiating the events, which occurred on Tuesday at 2 p.m. on February 29th, 1933. And it said the services happened in Irving Park. So Bradley would have traveled from his church, which would have been about 6 miles away from Bruce, to this more local congregation to officiate over the services. I haven't heard any family stories about how exactly Preston Bradley became the person to speak at his services, but I did see that Bradley has a lot of his papers at the library at University of Illinois in Chicago, so I went there to see if I was able to pull the sermon or any other identifying information as it related to Bruce on that day in February. But I wasn't able to find anything related directly to Bruce, but I was able to find something tangentially related to him. The broadcast sermon that he gave a week after Bruce's death, on March 5th, 1933, broadcast over WBBM on Sunday from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. And his sermon was entitled, How to Overcome Fear. I know it could be an attenuated connection, and maybe he had this written before he gave the funeral services for Bruce just a week prior, but I have to think that part of this sermon was at least in part reminding him about how Bruce stood up to fear. Quoting from Dr. Bradley's opening passage, I want to speak tonight in a friendly, practical sort of way about one of the biggest words in the English language and one of the shortest. It's just a little word, has only 4 letters in it, but it's probably the biggest word in our language in some respects. A little word that is called fear. End quote. Later on in the sermon, quoting, all these fears have their counterpart in the complexities of our modern civilization, and they are still the dominating motifs of much of our associational life. We are still afraid of the things over which we think we have no control. No man or woman in this audience tonight is afraid of anything which he or she can control. If we feel that we possess the mastery over every experience in our lives, and that we are in control by directive power, then we do not fear. And that introduces a kind of fear which I believe is wholesome. But just as long as an individual feels that he is so much in control of what he is doing and of the results of that doing, so nothing can react to injure him, then you have a dangerous manifestation of power. End quote. To me, this section speaks to Bruce in his life. Bruce lived in an out-of-control system in which there were so many moving parts that he did not have the ability to change or control. But yet he took back his power by controlling his own narrative and his own actions as much as he could in this time period of turmoil, violence, and danger. And he did that by listening, I presume, to his truest self. And so when confronted by Maloney with bribes and the like, there was no way he was ever going to take them, because to take them would be to compromise, not just on himself, but on the control that he had in his own situation. It would be to let fear win. Instead, he took back the control that he had, and in theory, created what Dr. Bradley would consider a dangerous manifestation of power. Later on in this sermon, Dr. Bradley spoke about death, quoting, "Death is the twin sister of sleep, and I think just as painless and just as beautiful. You never remember the hour when you fell asleep, and you will never remember the hour of the visit of the black agent. Why? That is so beautiful. That is life, you see. So many people are afraid to die. There is another fear. Blah, 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 blah. For nearly 21 years, I have been seeing people die in Chicago. I have stood beside the dead several times every week. I'm constantly with them. And you want to know the result of 21 years' experience of watching people die? I have never yet found a person who was afraid to die who had lived this life beautifully and well. The only people who have been afraid to die are those persons who had something on their consciences and who didn't wish to die until they got it all cleaned up. That's just the way people are. Any man anywhere who has treated this life with dignity, with distinction, and who has done his best need never be afraid of death. It's just as natural to die as it is to be born, and just as necessary. Just as necessary. End quote. Dr. Bradley goes on to talk a little bit more about death, but to me, again, this speaks to Bruce's life. Bruce was someone who had lived his life beautifully and well. And I'm not trying to hype him up as if he's on this holier-than-thou pedestal. I'm sure there are still many things he wished to improve on in his life, but I do think he had his basic core principles together. And that's particularly interesting to me at this time in our current history when that seems to be in question for many others. And Bradley's passage here makes me think about what he possibly said a week prior at Bruce's funeral. I bet you he said that Bruce wasn't afraid to die. I mean, how could he be? He was constantly facing death, running through the street at the Board of Trade building a year before he died, having a pistol pressed to his temple by Maloney at his office, having his youngest son almost taken from his backyard. And yet, he did not buckle. And when I read newspaper passages of Edna describing Bruce's death, she didn't want him to. She wanted him to be wholly himself. The only difference she wanted, though, was the outcome. She wished he didn't have to die, but she didn't wish that he hadn't stood up for what he believed in. One last passage from Dr. Bradley, quoting, "So I am not afraid of death. That isn't boasting or braggadocio. I look at death with awe. I am always awe-stricken in the presence of death. Death seems so complete to me. It's the most complete thing I know. I'm not afraid because my philosophy is just this, and it's one of the ways to overcome your fears, that being the only reason I am giving it to you. I have lived in this world long enough to accept it. What do you think of that? Yes, I have lived in this world long enough to accept it. I didn't make its laws. I didn't create it. I am here without being consulted, and I shall leave this world without being considered. I shall have nothing to say about it. When my work is through, it's over, and I accept that like I accept the air I breathe. Why not?" End quote. This reminded me of what Dr. Bradley said about control. Bruce could not control that he was going to die. However, he knew that he was always in the presence, potentially, of death, and that it would be complete. And I have to imagine he wasn't afraid of it. The line that Dr. Bradley says, "I have lived in this world long enough to accept it," I think would have really resonated with Bruce. If you'd like to see a copy of Bruce's funeral card, I will upload it on all the social media for you to see. And starting with next week, this investigation is going to start to go by suspect, starting with none other than William Maloney. And I do really think we're looking for 3 or potentially 4 people. And as we go in this next step of our investigation, I want to be really thinking, if we're looking at potentially 4 people, who's involved with the streetlights, who's sitting in the car, who's driving the car, and who fired the shots. And because I love leaving little things at the end of the episode for you, there is something else about our eyewitness account that I wanted to let you in on. It is possible that the eyewitnesses' children are still alive. I was not able to find death records for them, so even though this murder took place a long time ago, there may still be a present-day connection to what happened. Join me for next week's episode, In the Snake.